Welcome to History to Snooze By. Tonight, we invite you to step quietly into the long, frozen nights of medieval Europe, a world lit by firelight, warmed by breath, and bound together by resilience. This is not a tale of kings and castles, but of the quiet strength of those who endured the cold with little more than wool, straw, and one another. So settle in, lie back, let the rhythm of the past guide you into rest. And if you find comfort in these stories, if the flicker of history helps you drift, please consider liking this video, subscribing to the channel, and leaving a comment below. We'd love to know what stories you'd like us to dream through next. Now, close your eyes. The fire is warm, the wind has quieted, and the winter begins. Chapter 1: When the Cold Came Knocking. The world was different then. Quieter, slower. A rhythm of life shaped not by clocks or screens, but by the turning of the earth and the changing of the seasons. And when winter came, it did not simply arrive. It descended, steady and unrelenting, as if the very breath of the land turned to ice. For a medieval peasant, winter was not a season to be celebrated. There were no holidays with twinkling lights or warm fires crackling in spacious rooms. There were no thick coats, central heating, or insulated walls. Winter was a test, a long, drawn-out battle between the body and the cold, between hunger and the thin stores in the cellar, between survival and the silence that waited just beyond the edge of the hearth fire. Tonight, as you lie down in your warm bed, listening to the soft hum of modern life, imagine for a moment what it might have felt like to live in a time where even the act of surviving a single winter night was a quiet act of courage. The days grew short. The sun lingered low on the horizon, casting long, tired shadows across the fields. The last harvest had been gathered: turnips, onions, parsnips, all stored away in cellars, tied in bundles, or hidden beneath straw. Every root, every grain mattered. What was taken in would have to last until the earth softened again and new shoots returned. The animals were brought in closer. Cows, pigs, chickens, not just for protection from thieves or wild creatures, but for warmth. Their breath, their bodies, the slow rhythm of their movement all helped to push back against the creeping cold that pressed in from every direction. The home, if it could be called that, was simple. A single room, perhaps two if the family was lucky. Walls made of wattle and daub, sticks woven like baskets, covered in a rough mix of mud, straw, and dung. It sounds crude, and it was, but it was what they had. The wind still found its way through the cracks, whistling across the floor and rattling whatever hung near the door. There was no insulation, just layers of cloth, bundled rags, and the hope that what kept out the wind one night would still hold the next. The roof sagged low. Thatched and patched, it groaned under the weight of snow and rain. Leaks were common. A drip in the corner, a soft splatter onto the dirt floor in the middle of the night. Buckets were placed to catch the water, or old cloths laid down to absorb it. It wasn't much, but it was part of life. No one expected dry walls. They just hoped the leaks wouldn't fall directly on the bed. And the floor, it was earth. Hard, cold earth. In the summer, it was dusty and dry. In winter, slick with frost or soft with mud. Straw was laid down in layers to soften the step and keep out the worst of the damp. Over time, that straw mixed with dirt, spilled food, and ash. It grew dark, matted, and alive with things best left unmentioned. But it was better than sleeping on bare ground. As the light faded early each evening, the fire in the center of the room became everything. It was more than a source of heat. It was the heart of the home. The fire was where food was prepared, where stories were told, where warmth gathered, and so did the people. Children, parents, grandparents all huddled close, each seeking just a little more comfort from the glowing coals. The fire had no chimney. Smoke drifted upward slowly, filling the rafters and curling against the beams. Eventually, it would seep out through a hole in the roof or through the same cracks that let in the cold. Eyes stung, throats burned, but the fire had to stay. There was no choice. Letting the flames die meant letting winter win. There was no fuel to waste. Wood was precious. In many villages, peasants were not even allowed to gather it freely. Instead, they made do with what they could collect: fallen branches, dried animal dung, peat from the bogs. The fire was fed slowly, deliberately, each ember guarded like a secret. Before bed, the coals were banked, buried in ash to keep them alive until morning. A small pile of warmth tucked away, hoping it would survive the long night. Clothing was not changed daily. It was worn until it wore out. Tunics made of coarse wool, cloaks that had seen many winters, boots if one was lucky. More often, feet were wrapped in rags, stuffed into wooden clogs, or simply left bare by the fire until sleep came. Layers mattered. A second tunic, a belt to hold it tight, perhaps a patch of fur or a hat pulled low. Every bit of cloth added a degree of survival. Beds were simple too. A wooden frame if the family had one. Otherwise, just straw piled on the floor. A blanket, perhaps two. A sleeping mat shared by everyone, parents, children, even the animals when it was cold enough. There was no privacy, there was no space, but there was warmth in proximity. Huddled together, the family became its own furnace. And still, the cold found them. It crept in through the walls, drifted down from the rafters, rose up from the floor. It lived in the corners, waited near the door, and pressed against the sleeping bodies like a silent guest. Each night was a challenge. To fall asleep meant surrendering to the dark, to the cold, to the quiet fear that morning might not come. Some nights, the fire refused to catch. Some nights, the wind howled so fiercely it sounded like a living thing. Some nights, a baby cried for warmth it would not find. And still they endured. They prayed. Not loudly, not in grand ceremonies, but quietly, together. A whispered plea before bed, a murmur of hope, a simple request, let us see the sun again. Let us wake up, let us live. Outside, the world slept too. Trees stood bare and still, their limbs raised like arms toward the gray sky. The fields were empty, the earth frozen. No crops, no work to be done, only the waiting for the thaw, for the light, for spring. But that was far off. For now it was winter. Deep, hard, silent winter. And the peasants, tired, soot-streaked, wrapped in every scrap of warmth they owned, faced it as they always had. With stubborn hearts, with quiet grit, with the knowledge that the night must be endured, that the ember must be kept alive. And so, they slept. Or tried to, wrapped in straw, breathing slowly through their noses to keep the cold from burning their lungs, dreaming, if they could, of warmer days. You can almost hear the wind outside, can't you? But here, in your bed, in this quiet moment, you are warm, safe, sheltered. The cold is just a memory now. But once, long ago, it was everything. Sleep well, and we'll return tomorrow to the next chapter of survival and the many small acts of bravery that defined winter in a world without comfort. Chapter 2: The Wind Beneath the Walls. It begins with a sound, not a voice, not a bird, but wind, thin, sharp, and steady. It slips beneath the doorframe and whispers through the cracks, curling against the skin like a ghostly hand. A medieval peasant's home was never built for comfort. It was built for necessity. Quickly raised, patched together with what could be found nearby. Wood, straw, mud, dung. It was shelter, but only just. And when winter came, these homes groaned under the weight of what they were never meant to bear. Imagine the edge of a village. A cluster of huts low to the ground, slumped together like tired travelers huddled for warmth. The walls, at first glance, seem solid, but step closer and you see the truth. They are not built of stone, not even heavy timber. Instead, the frame is made of thin, rough branches woven together like a basket. Over this lattice is smeared a paste of earth and straw, mixed with animal dung to bind it tight. This is wattle and daub, an ancient technique, affordable, accessible, and terribly vulnerable. In the spring, it holds up well enough. In summer, the sun dries the walls until they are baked and hard. But when winter arrives with its damp and its frost, the walls begin to crack. Mud crumbles. Straw peeks through. Rain seeps in and wind follows behind it. Inside the house, the cold doesn't stay outside. It moves freely. There are no sealed windows, no insulation. The walls have gaps too small to see, but large enough to let the chill pour through like mist. In the corner, a rag might be stuffed into a hole where the daub has fallen away. Along the base of the wall, Old cloths are pushed tight to keep out the rising damp, but there is always another crack, another whisper of air, another icy draft brushing the toes at night. The roof offers little more comfort. Thatched from straw or reeds, it is layered thick, but time and weather wear it down. Birds nest in its eaves. Snow gathers in its valleys. Rain creeps between the bundles and begins a slow descent. A drip, then another. Eventually, a soft pattering in the dark that wakes the sleepers below. They patch it with more straw, with turf if they can find it, with whatever dry material they can beg, borrow, or lift from a neighbor's pile. But still it leaks. Still it sighs under the weight of snow. On bad nights, a whole corner may collapse, sending a curtain of wet straw tumbling into the hearth. The hearth, of course, is the only real warmth. But even it cannot keep the entire house hot. Not when the wind moves so freely. Not when the air outside is colder than stone. The fire glows, the smoke curls upward, but it struggles. The heat radiates only a short distance before it is swallowed by the surrounding chill. And the smoke, it has nowhere to go. There is no chimney, just a small vent in the roof if the home is lucky. More often, the smoke lingers inside. It coils beneath the ceiling, stains the beams black, stings the eyes of those gathered close. But they do not complain. Smoke means the fire is alive, and the fire means life. Windows are rare. Glass is precious, found only in the homes of lords and bishops. In the peasant hut, a window is nothing more than a hole in the wall covered perhaps with a thin piece of cowhide stretched and dried until it is translucent. It lets in a little light. It lets out a great deal of warmth. At night, these windows are covered with wood or heavy cloth, nailed in place or pinned with bones. But the wind still finds a way. It breathes around the frame, curls along the edges, and slips inside like a shadow. The door, too, is no great barrier. A single plank, sometimes just two boards lashed together. It creaks. It swells with damp. It shrinks in frost. Gaps open at the bottom where mice squeeze in during the night. Gaps form at the top where the air flows unchecked. A simple latch holds it shut. On stormy nights, it rattles, trembles, and sometimes bursts open if not weighted down with stone. And beneath it all is the floor. Not wood, not stone, just earth. Beaten flat by generations of feet. In dry weather, it's dusty and cracked. In winter, it's a sponge. Moisture rises from the frozen ground, slickening the surface. Straw is laid down in layers, but it grows wet. The wetness turns to mold. The mold to rot. Still, it is better than nothing. Better than sleeping directly on the mud. Over time, these homes become patchworks of survival. Extra layers of daub slapped onto the coldest corners. Moss pressed into holes where light leaks in. Old wool stuffed between roof beams. If something holds heat, even a little, it is used. Some peasants go so far as to build a second wall inside the first. A wall of woven branches or boards set just a few feet from the outer shell. Between the two, they stuff straw, rags, or dried leaves. It is not elegant, but it slows the wind. It buys a few degrees of warmth, and in winter, a few degrees can be the difference between a restless sleep and no sleep at all. At the coldest times, the family may abandon their own beds and huddle directly beside the hearth. They move their straw mats to the center of the room, curl up together, and sleep in a pile of blankets, limbs, and breath. Even then, the cold creeps in. There is no true barrier. Only layers. Only cleverness. Only stubborn effort against a force that never sleeps. And yet these homes were not failures. They were lived in, repaired, adapted, season after season. They were built not with comfort in mind, but with survival at heart. A place to sleep, a place to eat, a place to shelter the children and keep the fire going. That was enough. When the wind howled outside and the walls trembled, the people inside listened. They pressed their hands to the earth. They watched the coals. They said quiet words in the dark. And they waited for morning. Because every home, no matter how fragile, holds within it a small defiance, a refusal to yield, a flame protected by mud and straw and faith. And in that quiet courage, In those patched walls and shivering beams, there is something noble, something enduring. The houses may have been cold, but the hearts within them were not. Chapter 3: The Fire That Never Slept. In the center of every peasant home, where the floor was packed tight with years of footsteps and the smoke curled slow and steady, there lived a fire. Not a grand fireplace with a polished stone mantel, not a glowing hearth framed by iron and tile, just a pit, a ring of stones blackened by time, nestled in the dirt floor. Around it, life turned, slowly, steadily, like the seasons themselves. The fire was never just a fire. It was the heart of the home, beating low and warm in the long nights of winter. It gave more than heat. It gave light, safety, and a fragile kind of hope. Every morning, long before the first rays of sunlight touched the frost-covered earth, someone would rise to check the coals. Eyes barely open, hands stiff from the cold, they would crawl close to the fire's sleeping form. With fingers trembling, they would brush away the ash, slowly, gently, searching for the faintest ember hiding beneath. If they found one, still glowing, still alive, they would breathe. Softly at first, then again, and again. The ember would glow brighter. A small miracle in a world of cold. A spark of yesterday carried into today. Kindling would follow. Dried twigs, bits of straw, sometimes scraps of cloth. The fire would catch, rise, and slowly come back to life. Not roaring, but alive. That was enough. But if no ember remained, if the ash was cold and gray, the morning turned long. Flint and steel had to be struck. Sparks coaxed onto dry moss or brittle leaves, and if those failed, someone would walk, sometimes across the village, to borrow a glowing coal from a neighbor's hearth. Fire, like bread, was shared when needed. Letting the fire die wasn't just careless. It was dangerous. The fire was warmth, yes, but it was also protection. It kept the dark at bay. It held back the cold that crept through the walls, the cold that waited outside the door, and sometimes even the cold that rose from within one's own skin. There were no chimneys in most peasant homes. The smoke didn't go up and out. It went up and then sideways. It gathered in the thatch above. It hung low in the room. It wrapped itself around beams and drifted through every crevice it could find. It stung the eyes. It coated the lungs, but no one complained, because that smoke, as choking as it could be, also drove away fleas. It masked the smell of damp animals and unwashed clothes. It preserved meat hung high in the rafters. And most of all, it proved the fire was alive. The fire was always tended. Someone was always watching. Even the smallest children knew not to stray too far from the glow. They learned young how to feed the flames, how to bank the coals, how to stir the ash with the edge of a stick. It was knowledge passed down in silence, in gestures, in the shared rhythm of survival. Before bed each night, there was a ritual. The coals were pushed together, nestled close. A mound of ash was drawn over the top, thick and careful. This was fire banking. It didn't extinguish the flame, it sheltered it, protected it through the night. The ash worked like a blanket, keeping the heat in, hiding it from the drafts that crept across the floor. And in the morning, if the gods were kind and the work had been done well, that ember would still be there, waiting, glowing faintly. Proof that the household had made it through one more frozen night. The fire also cooked every meal. Simple food, yes, thick porridge, flat bread, root vegetables boiled until soft. But hot food was more than fuel. It was warmth that could be felt in the bones. A bowl of steaming stew was a shield against the cold. A sip of warm broth was comfort that wrapped around the chest. The fire gave light too, flickering, dancing, golden. It cast shadows on the wall and played in the children's eyes. When the sun dipped below the horizon and the wind began to speak outside, the fire became the only glow in the world. Everything else faded. Only the orange pulse of flame remained. Families gathered near it. They didn't have books. They didn't have clocks. Time was measured by the fire, how long the coals glowed, how far the flame reached, how dark the corners of the room became. People talked in low voices. They told stories. They sang softly. Sometimes they just listened to the crackle, the pop, the long stretch of silence between breaths. The fire was also dangerous. A spark landing in the wrong place could catch a roof alight. A careless log could roll too far and burn a bare foot. Sometimes a child would crawl too close and wake with singed hair or blistered hands. There were no fire guards, no iron grates, just watchful eyes and quiet warnings. Still, the fire was trusted. It was familiar. It was the one constant through all the seasons, but especially in winter, when the wind tore at the walls, when snow gathered against the door, when breath hung in the air like mist. Even the animals knew its pull. A dog might curl close to the hearth. A cat, if the family had one, might stretch across the warm stones. Chickens, goats, and sometimes even pigs were drawn to its glow, their warmth adding to the human circle around it. On the coldest nights, the fire was not just in the hearth. It lived in the hearts of those gathered near. It whispered in their sleep. It hummed beneath their skin. It said, "You're still here. You're still alive." The fire was humble. It didn't roar. It didn't blaze. But it endured. And when the snow fell heavy and the night stretched long, the fire stayed. It waited. It warmed. It remembered. It never truly slept. Chapter 4: Cold Beneath the Skin. It always started from below. Even with the door closed, even with the fire burning low in the center of the room, the cold rose, slowly, silently, from the ground itself. A chill that did not blow or rattle or howl. It crept. It seeped. It moved like water through fabric, through skin, through bone. There was no floor in a medieval peasant's house. Not as we think of it. No wood planks. No stone tiles. Just dirt. Hard-packed earth flattened by time and footsteps. It was brown, dry, and dusty in summer, but in winter it became something else. Cold. Wet. Unforgiving. They tried to fight it the only way they could, with layers. The first defense was straw, piles of it, laid thick across the floor. It crackled underfoot and shifted with every movement. It wasn't comfortable, but it helped. Straw could lift the body just enough above the freezing ground to offer some barrier. Not much, but some. When straw ran low, they used rushes, long grasses cut from marshy places before the frost came, dried in bundles, then scattered over the floor. Sometimes mixed with herbs, lavender, rosemary, not for beauty but for the scent. A kindness to mask the odors that gathered where so many lived in such close quarters. But over time, those rushes flattened. The straw broke down. Dust, crumbs, mud, bits of spilled food, it all blended together into something dense and dark. A mat of life and decay. It softened the floor, yes, but it also held moisture. And in winter, that meant cold. At night, families spread bedding on top of this layer. Bedding was generous in name. Most had little more than a sack filled with old straw. Some added dried leaves or rags. If they were fortunate, perhaps a bit of wool. There were no pillows, no springs, just a pile of scratchy material on top of a cold floor. The beds were shared. A single mattress, if it could be called that, might hold 2, 3, even 4 people. Children squeezed between adults. Elders curled at the edges. Everyone wrapped in every piece of fabric they owned. Tunics doubled as blankets, cloaks as covers. It wasn't about comfort. It was about warmth. And still the cold came. It came through the floor, through the straw, through the fabric. It moved through sleeping bodies and settled into joints, into chests, into toes. Some described it as a weight, not just a temperature, but a heaviness, a slow pressing force that made limbs stiff and thoughts cloudy. It settled in quietly and never quite left. To sleep was not to rest, it was to brace. To lie still enough not to let warmth escape, but to shift just enough to keep the blood moving. People turned often, not to get comfortable. Comfort was not expected, but to keep from freezing one side entirely. And if you dropped something in the night, a cloth, a wooden spoon, a bit of bread, it didn't land on a floor. It vanished into a cold that claimed it instantly. In the morning, it would be stiff, damp, sometimes frozen in place. Children were bundled tightly, wrapped like turnips in layers, their breath visible in the dark, their small fingers curled into fists beneath rags. Parents lay with arms draped protectively, sharing body heat the way one shares fire. Still, many nights were restless. Feet would cramp, legs would ache, cold would nibble at fingers and noses, and outside, beyond the fragile walls, frost crept along the bare ground. It climbed slowly up the doorframe. It pressed its pale hand against the windows, if there were windows at all. Some families kept warm stones near their beds. Heated by the fire and wrapped in cloth, these stones could be slipped beneath the straw to provide a little warmth. It didn't last long, but for a few precious minutes, it soothed the sting of the frozen ground. Others slept in shifts, one person tending the fire while the rest tried to doze. The firekeeper would occasionally walk the floor, stomping gently, shaking off the stillness that so easily turned to stiffness. Motion, even a little, was a kind of shield. On the coldest nights, animals were brought in closer. A goat might lie near the bedding. A dog, if there was one, might curl beside a child. Their bodies added heat. Their breath added moisture to the air. Their presence reminded the family that they were not alone in the fight against the cold. Some mornings, the straw mattress had to be peeled away from the floor, frozen slightly at the edges. Some mornings, frost had crept inside the room itself, forming crystals on the inner walls or on the cloths pinned across the windows. People would wake with stiff fingers, aching backs, red noses, and cracked lips. But if they woke at all, that was already a kind of victory. The floor beneath them did not care. The dirt, the straw, the frost, they remained the same. Quiet. Still, indifferent. But the people above it, the peasants, they adapted. They layered. They bundled. They leaned on one another. They knew the cold would always return, that it lived not just in the air, but in the bones of the house itself. And so, they built their lives above it, straw upon earth, hope upon hardship. They slept in the dark. They rose in the dark. And day after day, night after night, they endured. Because that's what survival looked like in the medieval winter. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud. It was a quiet, determined breath in the cold. Again and again and again. Chapter 5. The Armor of Layers. In the quiet before dawn, when the frost still clung to the walls and the fire in the hearth was only a whisper, the work of dressing began. Not for beauty, not for style, but for survival. In a world without insulation, without heating, without weatherproof walls or sealed windows, the first and most personal shield against winter's grip was the body itself. And to protect it, peasants layered what little they had: wool, linen, leather, and sometimes dirt. Each piece of clothing, each fold of cloth was less a garment and more a piece of armor. Not polished like a knight's, not shining, but heavy, scratchy, and necessary. The first layer was usually linen, a tunic or shift worn close to the skin. It wasn't soft, it wasn't clean, but it formed the foundation. On top of that came wool, spun from coarse fibers woven tightly, thick and heavy. Wool retained heat even when damp. It scratched the skin, clung to sweat, and often smelled of the animal it came from. But it was warm. And warmth was everything. One tunic was rarely enough. If a peasant owned two, both were worn at once. If there was a third, patched, fraying, riddled with holes, it went on to. The goal was not comfort. It was layering. Like bark on a tree. Like the coats of an onion. The more, the better. Cloaks were common, though not elegant. Usually they were simple woolen wraps, fastened with a wooden clasp or knotted at the neck. They draped over the shoulders, heavy with wear, sometimes stiff with old sweat and rain. If the edges frayed or tore, patches were added. If the fabric grew thin, old pieces of tunic were sewn inside as lining. Legs, too, were wrapped. Long woolen hoses or breeches sagged at the knees. Strips of cloth, known as patas or bindings, were wound around calves and ankles to hold warmth and keep the cold from creeping under. And feet were the hardest to protect. Leather boots were rare. Most peasants wrapped their feet in old rags and pushed them into wooden clogs. These clogs were carved roughly, never quite fitting, and often let in snow through the cracks. In especially harsh weather, more rags were added, stuffed between toes, layered until movement grew stiff and slow. It was better than frostbite, but not by much. Hats were prized. A simple woolen cap, pulled down tight over the ears, could mean the difference between a cold night and a dangerous one. Gloves were harder to come by. Some wore fingerless mitts made from sheepskin or worn leather. Others wrapped their hands in layers of cloth or tucked them under cloaks pressed against the body, hidden from the air. Children were bundled until they waddled. Layers upon layers, sleeves trailing, hoods tied tight beneath red noses and chapped cheeks. They looked less like children and more like small, unsteady bundles of cloth, warm if immobile. And over time, something strange happened. As the days grew colder and the nights stretched longer, the clothes, worn constantly, rarely removed, began to change. Not just in appearance, but in weight, in texture, in smell. They gathered grime. Smoke from the fire, grease from the hearth, mud from the path outside. They soaked in sweat, oils, the natural dust of daily living, and still they weren't washed. Not because peasants didn't care for cleanliness, but because washing meant risk. Water froze. Soap was scarce. And waiting for clothes to dry, damp and stiff on a freezing line, could take days. Days without warmth. Days without protection. So the layers stayed on. Day after day. Week after week. And slowly they became something else. Insulation. The buildup of dirt and grease, unpleasant as it may seem now, helped trap body heat. It filled the tiny holes between fibers. It sealed the weave. A crust formed, thin, grimy, clinging, and beneath it, the air stayed warmer. It was a kind of natural armor forged not by intention but by repetition, by necessity. To the medieval peasant, this wasn't strange. It was normal. Everyone smelled the same. Everyone wore the same fabric. Everyone itched the same way. And no one apologized for it. Because when the wind howled at the corners of the hut, when frost clung to the rafters, when the fire died low and the hearth was nothing but quiet coals, those layers, scratchy and stiff as they were, kept the cold at bay. They held in breath. They cradled warmth. They whispered survival. Every patch sewn onto a tunic was a memory. Every threadbare sleeve a story. This was the cloak grandfather wore when he fell ill and still recovered. These were the rags mother bound around her hands when she fetched firewood in the snow. This tunic, stained and frayed, had seen 5 winters and would see a 6th. No one threw clothing away. When a garment could no longer be worn, it was cut down for patches, turned into bindings, or used as bedding. A child might wear an adult's tunic, the hem dragging in the dirt, sleeves rolled and pinned. Clothing was not just worn, it was inherited. And through it all, the layers grew heavier. A peasant in full winter dress did not move quickly. The wool pulled at the shoulders. The clogs clacked against the frozen earth. Arms felt stiff. Legs moved with effort. But beneath those layers, the heart beat on. Warmth didn't come easy. It was earned, preserved, guarded. Every thread mattered. Every wrap of cloth. Every bit of sheep's wool spun into something that could hold heat just a little longer. Modern eyes might look back and see only discomfort. But what truly lived beneath those layers was endurance. It wasn't fashion. It was survival. And in the hush of winter, when all else was still, you could almost hear it. The soft rustle of fabric, the creak of a cloak, the patient weight of 1,000 threads carrying one life through the cold. Chapter 6. Sleeping shoulder to shoulder. When night fell in the medieval village, it fell all at once. The sun dipped low, shadows stretched long, and within moments the world was swallowed in a hush. No lanterns glowed from windows. No streetlights marked the path. Just the flicker of firelight behind thin shutters and the soft shuffle of feet preparing for rest. Sleep in those days did not come with solitude. It came with closeness. With shared space, shared breath, shared body heat. In the peasant's hut, there was no separate bedroom, no door to close behind you, no quiet place to stretch alone. The entire household slept together, shoulder to shoulder, cheek to cheek, in one tight, tangled heap of limbs and fabric and breath. Privacy was not a concept. It was a luxury that simply didn't exist. The space was small. One room, sometimes 2. The fire glowed low in the center. Around it, the sleeping places were arranged. Some had low wooden frames packed with straw or hay. Others slept directly on mats or piles of rushes on the hard earth. And into these spaces, every member of the family settled for the night. Parents, children, grandparents, infants swaddled in cloth. Toddlers curled against their mother's side. Older children tucked between adults, each person claiming a space not based on comfort but on warmth and proximity. On the coldest nights, even the animals joined in. A dog curled at the edge of the bed. A goat nestled near the fire. Chickens roosted on beams overhead, their soft clucking like distant lullabies. Sometimes a pig snored softly in the corner. The warmth they gave off was real and deeply valued. In a house where every breath turned to mist, one extra degree of heat could mean everything. It was not glamorous. It was not peaceful in the way we think of peace today. The room was often noisy, with snoring, coughing, shifting bodies, and the occasional bleat or grunt. But it was survival, and it was routine. People positioned themselves carefully. The frail and elderly were placed near the fire, where warmth could reach them most easily. Babies and young children were kept in the middle of the group, shielded on all sides. The strongest adults, those whose bodies held heat longest, slept on the outside, forming a human barrier against the cold that crept through the walls. This arrangement had its hazards. One wrong shift could roll a child into a draft. One snoring uncle might steal more than his share of the blanket. And if someone kicked in their sleep, there was no avoiding the domino of waking bodies and sharp whispers in the dark. But for all its discomfort, there was a kind of safety in the closeness. A kind of comfort that had nothing to do with softness and everything to do with presence. A family's warmth was shared warmth. One person's body helped keep another's blood moving. One steady breath calmed a restless child. One hand, placed lightly on a sibling's back, reminded them that they were not alone. There were no mattresses, no quilts, just layers of cloth and straw, cloaks pulled up to chins, arms wrapped around whoever lay nearest. Some nights, someone would sit up, coughing from the smoke or shifting to tend the fire. They might toss a few twigs onto the embers, stir the coals, then settle back down beside the others without a word. The room would flicker once more with faint orange light before fading again into the shadows. In winter, sleep was not guaranteed. The cold was always testing the edges, nibbling at toes, sneaking beneath blankets, pricking at noses. Some nights, people awoke shivering. Others never truly slept, drifting instead in that half-conscious state between rest and alertness. Yet sleep came, in its way. Slow, heavy, pulled down by exhaustion and the weight of wool and straw. It came in silence, broken only by breath and the low creak of the house settling into the cold. And in those moments, there was something deeply human about the closeness. The warmth of a sibling's arm pressed beside yours. The feel of another's breath on your shoulder. The comfort of hearing someone shift softly just an arm's length away. It was a kind of lullaby. Not sung, not spoken, but felt. No one complained about sharing space. They had never known anything different. And in a world where death came easily, with frost, with illness, with hunger, there was comfort in knowing that the people you loved were there beside you, alive, warm, wrapped in the same long night. Children would grow up and sleep the same way. Grandparents had done it before them. It was the rhythm of winter. Lie close, share what you have, and make it to morning together. Even the animals learned their place. A cow would settle in near the fire, chewing slowly, her body rising and falling in quiet rhythm. A dog might twitch in dreams. A chicken might cluck softly from the rafters, then drift back into silence. And outside the hut, the wind would press against the door. The frost would gather on the window skin. Snow might drift against the roof, weighing it down with a slow, quiet patience. But inside the shared heat of a family body, there was stillness. Not comfort, but endurance. Not luxury, but life. In the space where dreams flickered and breath rose like mist, something deeper held them all together. Not just necessity, not just warmth, but the ancient, instinctive understanding that we survive best when we sleep side by side. Chapter 7: A Barnyard Beneath the Rafters. When the frost thickened and the wind pressed like an invisible hand against every wall, the line between house and barn began to blur. In the medieval countryside, warmth was rare. It was not wasted. And in winter, anything that gave off heat, whether it had wool, feathers, or hooves, was welcome inside. At nightfall, as the fire dimmed and families settled down into their straw beds, they were not alone. A quiet symphony stirred in the corners. A snort. A rustle. The creak of hoof on dirt. The soft shuffle of feathered wings. The animals were here too. Cows, pigs, chickens, goats, not penned far away in a barn, but gathered under the same thatched roof, sharing the same cold air, breathing the same smoky warmth. It wasn't strange, it was survival. Peasant homes were often built to include a space for animals, not as a separate room, but as part of the main living area. Sometimes there was a low partition of woven branches to keep the livestock to one side. Sometimes nothing at all. Just a goat lying beside the hearth, a pig resting near the door, a chicken perched in the rafters overhead. The animals gave warmth. That was the first and most important thing. A single cow could radiate enough heat to raise the room's temperature by several degrees. Goats and sheep added to the mix, breathing, shifting, cuddling close. They were warm bodies in a house that could not hold heat on its own. And so people and animals slept together. Not in harmony always, but in proximity. A child might wake in the night to find a chicken nestled against their leg. A pig might grunt and roll, snatching another patch of floor. Cows would chew cud long after the house had gone quiet, their jaws working in slow rhythm, eyes half-lidded in peace. There were challenges, of course. The smell was constant, a mix of straw, dung, smoke, and sweat. A thick scent that clung to woolen cloaks and drifted into every corner. But people grew used to it. Their noses adapted. Cleanliness in the modern sense was not the goal. Warmth was. And animals, for all their mess, offered it. Noise was another matter. Chickens woke early, sometimes crowing before the light returned. Goats bleated in their sleep. Pigs snored like small living drums. A startled animal might crash against a wall, knocking over a pot or scattering embers. But these were accepted sounds, familiar, even comforting. Children learned early to sleep through it. Their lullabies included the lowing of cows, the cooing of hens, the rustle of hooves on straw. There were also practical reasons to keep animals indoors. Theft was a danger in the long nights. A hungry neighbor, a wandering thief, both could slip away with a valuable goat or chicken if left unwatched. Bringing livestock inside was protection not just from the cold, but from disappearance. And predators, foxes, wolves, even stray dogs could lurk at the edges of a darkened village. They too were kept at bay by locked doors and tightly packed homes. Some peasants, especially in colder regions, built homes with slightly sunken floors in the animal section. The warmth of the animals would rise into the living space above. Others placed the fire pit between the human and animal quarters, letting both draw from its heat. Over time, routines developed. In the evening, the animals were guided inside with gentle tugs and soft words. A cow might resist at first, stubborn and slow, but eventually she would settle near her usual corner. Chickens would be gathered and placed in baskets or allowed to find their way to high beams. Pigs needed the least direction, they simply flopped wherever space remained. Straw was laid for bedding, for humans and animals alike. At first fresh, then slowly flattened. A shared surface, dry as it could be, soft when possible. During the day, animals might be let out briefly, to graze, to stretch, to leave behind their mess. But in harsh storms or deep snows, they stayed in. And so the barnyard became a living room, a bedroom, a shared shelter against the deep freeze. There were hazards. An unexpected kick from a cow, a goat stepping onto someone's hand in the night, chickens scattering when the fire popped too loud. But for every moment of chaos, there were hours of shared warmth. A cow's breath steamed in the cold. A pig's belly gave off surprising heat. A rooster, despite its noise, lent a sense of rhythm to the day's start. And in that quiet cohabitation, there was a strange sort of bond. The animals were not pets. They were tools, providers of milk, eggs, wool, meat. But in winter, they were more than that. They were companions in survival. Living heaters, guardians of warmth, In the flickering shadows cast by a dwindling fire, a cow's broad shape might resemble a hulking piece of furniture. A goat might tuck its legs beneath itself and watch with blinking eyes as a baby was rocked to sleep beside it. A hen might cluck softly, shifting feathers, as a child murmured in dreams. People slept, animals slept, all beneath the same roof, all breathing the same air, all waiting for morning. Outside, the snow drifted against the door. The wind curled around the thatch. The world beyond the walls grew still and hard. But inside, the hut was alive. Smelly, yes. Crowded, often, but warm. And in the quiet moments just before dawn, when the fire was low and the stars still held the sky, there was something deeply human about it. A reminder that survival is not always graceful. That comfort can come with cloven hooves and feathered wings. That warmth, in the end, is warmth no matter where it comes from. In those nights, the barn and the home were one. A barnyard beneath the rafters, a chorus of breath, a gathering of hearts, human and beast, bound together by cold and firelight, all waiting for spring. Chapter 8: Supper Before Sleep. In a medieval winter, warmth came in many forms: a flicker of fire, a shared blanket, a quiet breath beneath a woolen hood. But among the most important and perhaps the most overlooked was food. Not for its taste, not for luxury, but for heat. Because before the fire was banked, before the rushes were smoothed for sleep, and before families curled together in the dark, there was always supper. Simple, heavy, necessary. It began with the pot. The iron pot that hung above the fire was more than a cooking vessel. It was a constant presence, blackened by smoke, worn by years of use. Its shape never changed, but what went into it did, depending on the season, the harvest, and the hunger in the household. In winter, the meals were thick, dense, designed to sit in the belly and burn slowly through the long, frozen hours of night. Stews were the favorite, not because they were fancy, but because they were forgiving. You could make a stew out of almost anything. Root vegetables, dried herbs, scraps of salted meat, a turnip here, an onion there, a bit of grain if it hadn't been ground into flour, some bread soaked into broth. All of it simmered together, stirred by tired hands, seasoned with smoke and survival. The longer the stew cooked, the richer it became. And in homes where nothing could be wasted, yesterday's stew became today's, deepened with whatever had been gathered, traded, or remembered at the last moment. A slice of salted pork saved for weeks might be added on special nights. Or a bone, long since picked clean, boiled again to tease out whatever was left. The pot was never truly empty. It held echoes of the days before, a thread of flavor stretching back into the past, anchoring the family in the present. Alongside the stew came bread. Not soft or warm, but thick and dark. Rye or barley, baked hard to last longer. Often stale, sometimes sour. But dipped in broth or warmed by the fire, it softened just enough. And then there were grains, oats, millet, spelt, boiled into thick porridge. Filling, bland, but hot. A bowl of steaming mush could warm hands, soothe the chest, and settle the mind before bed. This was not feasting. This was fueling. Because food in the cold months was more than sustenance. It was internal fire. A full belly helped the body stay warm longer. Digestion stoked the blood. Calories turned into heat. A dense supper meant a better chance of waking with fingers that still moved and feet that could still carry weight. Families knew this. Even the children. They didn't eat quickly. There was a ritual to it. Quiet, rhythmic, slow. Bowls passed hand to hand. Wooden spoons dipped and raised. Steam curling into the air above the fire. Conversation soft and sparse. The little ones were fed first. A spoonful blown gently cool. A piece of bread torn by a parent's calloused fingers. Grandparents next, their teeth worn, their appetites small but steady. Then the others, filling what space remained in the pot. Sometimes there wasn't enough for everyone. On those nights, parents gave more to the children. Adults drank extra water or filled their bellies with bread alone. No one complained. It was understood. Winter was a guest that stayed too long, and food was the price of its company. If there was something sweet, a dried apple, a smear of honey, it was rare, and shared in silence with smiles that softened even the hardest faces. After the bowls were emptied, they were cleaned with whatever could be spared. Snow, a twist of cloth, sometimes just a rub with a crust of bread. Everything was saved. Nothing was left to waste. Then came the fire, the last of the kindling tossed on. The pot pulled aside. The coals stirred gently, banked with ash, and the people, warm in belly if not in body, began to settle. But the meal lingered. You could feel it in the chest, that quiet fullness. Not comfort exactly, but calm, as if the warmth that began at the tongue had made its way to the heart. Sleep came easier with food inside. The cold still pressed against the walls. The wind still whistled through the shutter gaps. But inside, the body worked, slowly digesting, slowly warming. Children drifted off with full stomachs and heavy limbs. Adults rested, hands across their middles, eyes closed in silence. Even the animals grew still, their own meals finished, their breath slow and steady in the dark. And outside, the snow kept falling. But inside, the last warmth of the stew still lived in the people who had shared it. A single pot, a few bowls, and the memory of heat not just in the fire, but in the food. This was how they faced the night. Not with wealth, not with ease, but with supper. Before sleep. Chapter 9. Neighbors in the Storm. In winter, the wind did not just chill the body, it tested the soul. It howled through the trees. It pressed against doors. It crept through cracks in the walls, seeking out warmth like a thief in the night. And when it came, no one faced it alone. Because in a medieval village, survival was not a solitary act. It was shared, carried, watched over. It lived in the quiet footsteps that crossed the snow before dawn, in the hand that knocked gently on a neighbor's door, in the bundle of wood left beside a hearth that had grown cold. When the cold grew deep and the nights too long to bear, it was the people, the village itself, that became a kind of shelter. Houses stood close together, not just for space or convenience, but for protection. The warmth of one wall might bleed into another. The sound of a cough from next door might be heard through a thin shutter. Smoke from chimneys rose together, signs of life, of warmth, of the fire still burning. And when the smoke stopped rising, that's when people noticed. Not with alarm at first, just with watchfulness. Old Martha hasn't come to market. Has anyone seen Thomas since the last snowfall? That fire's not been lit since Tuesday. Quiet words passed in low voices. Not gossip, concern. In the coldest weeks, some villagers made a habit of checking windows at sunrise, watching for movement, listening for sound, looking for footprints in the snow. Those who were young and able took turns walking the paths, even in the cold. Wrapped in cloaks, boots heavy with frost, they moved from house to house, just to be sure. A knock. "Are you all right in there?" Inside, sometimes the answer was no. A fire had gone out. A pot had been empty for days. An elder had fallen ill. And that was when help came, not with fanfare, but with a bucket of coals, a ladle of stew, a steadying arm. Embers were shared carefully, bundled in ash, wrapped in cloth, cradled like gold, passed hand to hand, from one hearth to another. Not all houses could relight a fire on their own. Sometimes the flint was missing, sometimes the hands were too old, too cold, too weak. A single coal could mean the difference between enduring the night and not waking at all. And no one kept fire to themselves. There was no shame in knocking on a neighbor's door and asking for warmth, because everyone understood winter was a thief. It took what it could when it could. And tomorrow it might take from you. So today you helped. Children learned this too. They ran messages between homes, carried bundles of kindling, delivered crusts of bread or handfuls of beans. Small tasks, but meaningful. Even those too old to walk still watched. From the doorway, from the corner of the hearth. They noticed who passed, who struggled, who needed a word, a hand, a bowl of broth. There were always feuds, of course. Arguments over goats or boundaries or borrowed pots. But in winter, most of those fell quiet. Not out of forgiveness, perhaps, but necessity. because even a rival might be the one to notice your fire had gone out. And when snow gathered heavy on the roof and icicles hung thick from the eaves, no one wished harm on their neighbors. Not truly, because they knew no one survives the storm alone. There were stories passed down from village to village, stories of winter so cruel they took entire households, of families found in spring still huddled in straw, frozen in place, of roofs that caved under snow, walls that collapsed under wind. But there were other stories too, stories of bread shared by candlelight, of neighbors sleeping under one roof, cloaks layered on the floor, of fires relit by borrowed flame, of hands that reached out through the frost and pulled someone back toward life. In some villages, there were watchmen, not soldiers, but elders or strong youths who stayed awake longer, peeking from behind doors, listening for the silence that signaled something was wrong. And when they noticed, they didn't wait. One man carried a kettle of soup across a frozen field. A woman gave her last blanket to the sick boy down the lane. A child sat beside the fire with someone else's grandmother, just to keep her company. And so the storm passed, not quickly, not kindly, but with less damage than it could have done. Because the village had held together, not with walls or iron or wealth, but with people, with eyes that watched, with ears that listened, with hands that offered coals. And when morning came, with mist still clinging to the frost and the fire still only aglow beneath the ash, they woke knowing they had made it through the night again. Together, not because they had everything, but because they had each other. Chapter 10. Prayers for Warmth. When the night pressed in tight and the fire sank low in the hearth, there was one last thing to do before sleep. The family would kneel, quietly, wherever space allowed, on the straw-covered floor beside the embers in corners where the wind tapped gently at the walls, hands folded, heads bowed, and in voices no louder than the crackle of the coals, they prayed. Not for riches, not for ease, just for warmth. And one more morning. In the medieval world, faith wasn't reserved for Sundays. It was woven into the rhythms of daily life, in work, in meals, and most tenderly, in the stillness just before rest. Especially in winter, when so much felt uncertain. The cold was more than a discomfort. It was a threat that crept close and stayed long. So peasants turned to what they had always turned to, the unseen, the sacred, the divine. They whispered prayers to saints, to the Virgin, to Christ on the cross who had once known suffering and might understand theirs. They asked for warmth not just for their bodies, but for their homes, their animals, their children. One of the saints they called upon was Saint Blaise, the protector of throats. The cold, after all, was quick to settle in the chest. Coughs could turn to fevers. Breaths could grow shallow. And so they asked him to watch over their voices, their lungs, their fragile health. They might also pray to Saint Nicholas, not yet the jolly figure of modern stories, but a protector of the poor. They asked him to shield their homes from ruin, to keep the fire from going out, to keep hunger from knocking too hard at the door. Candles were lit, if they had them, narrow, tallow candles, smoky and plain. The flame swayed gently in the cold air, a flickering echo of the fire that burned nearby. Some believed the candlelight carried prayers upward. Others saw it as a small reminder that not all light had left the world. Holy water, when it could be found or borrowed, was sprinkled near the hearth, across the lintel, along the floor where the cold came creeping in. And some marked their doors with blessed chalk, strange symbols drawn after feast days, simple crosses traced with care. It wasn't just tradition. It was a message to the unseen. This house is guarded. Because in winter, not all fears came from the weather. There were old stories, too, of spirits that roamed in the frost, of mischief carried on the wind. Some peasants placed bits of bread on the windowsill, offerings for wandering souls. Others hung herbs near the door, rosemary, sage, even garlic, to ward off sickness and shadow alike. Superstition and faith lived side by side. There was no contradiction, just layers like the tunics they wore. Protection upon protection, hope upon hope. Children learned the prayers early. Not recited, but shared, whispered during sickness, mumbled during storms. They repeated what they heard from their elders. Bless this fire, O Lord. Let it last till morning. It wasn't about perfect words. It was about rhythm, repetition, something to say while the wind moaned outside and the straw rustled beneath tired hands. Sometimes the prayers turned to memory, a lost neighbor, a child taken too soon, a cow that didn't survive the frost. Names were spoken in the quiet, not mournfully, just softly, as if saying them aloud might keep them warm wherever they now rested. And then there were the promises, the kind made not with parchment, but with breath. If we see spring, I'll help old Agnes with her thatching. If the cow lives through this winter, I'll offer half her milk to the church. If the baby wakes well tomorrow, I'll walk to the shrine, no matter the snow. They weren't bargains. They were offerings. Small, honest tokens placed into the hands of something greater. Because faith, in those nights, wasn't about grandeur. It was about presence. It was about doing what you could with what you had and trusting the rest to the wind, the fire, and the stars. Some villagers had tiny wooden crosses on their walls. Others had nothing but the memory of a prayer passed down from a grandmother's lips. But all carried their hope in the same place, beneath their cloaks, in the spaces between their ribs, near the slow and steady rhythm of their hearts. And so, when the prayers were done, they would settle into their bedding. The children curled close, the animals shifting softly nearby, fire low and watchful. And in that moment, between wakefulness and sleep, between fear and peace, the warmth came, not just from the stew or the wool or the flicker of flame, but from belief that the morning would come, that the roof would hold, that the fire would still be glowing beneath its blanket of ash. And even if it didn't, even if the frost came in deeper than expected, someone somewhere would notice. A neighbor, a cousin, a passerby, someone would bring coals, someone would speak a name. Because in the medieval winter, prayers weren't just words. They were bridges, from one night to the next, from one home to another, from the earth to something far, far above. Chapter 11. The Ember Watch. Long after the stew had been eaten and the prayers whispered, after the animals had settled and the last cloak had been wrapped tight around weary shoulders, one quiet task remained. The fire. It could not be left to chance. In a world without matches or lighters, where flint and steel were slow and stubborn companions, the fire was not just warmth, it was life. And so, someone always watched. Each night, as the wind curled beneath the door and the frost thickened on the window skins, one pair of hands reached into the glowing bed of coals and began the ritual of banking the fire. It was done slowly, with quiet reverence. The embers, hot orange, pulsing, were gathered into the center of the hearth. Loose ash was gently drawn over them, layer by layer, until they were buried but not smothered, hidden from the air, yet still alive, like a heart wrapped in a blanket. This was fire banking. It wasn't just a habit. It was a safeguard, a way to stretch a single spark across the long, cold night. If done well, the embers would sleep, not die, and in the morning they would still be glowing, ready to wake with just a breath and a handful of straw. But if done poorly, if too much ash was added, the coals might choke. If too little, the draft might steal the heat. If the wind shifted, or the thatch above shifted, or if someone stumbled too close, the balance could be lost. And so the Ember Watch began. Not everyone at once, just one or two. Sometimes an adult, sometimes a grandparent who no longer worked the fields but still carried deep knowledge of fire. And sometimes, especially in larger families, a child old enough to be trusted with a stick and a steady eye. Their job was simple: keep the fire alive. They sat near the hearth, wrapped in thick cloaks, knees tucked beneath chins, eyes heavy with sleep. Now and then, they would stir the ash, listen to the soft hiss of heat beneath. If a spark dared to show itself, they would press the ash back over, whispering softly as if to calm it. It was not exciting. It was not glorious. It was quiet, slow, and cold, but it was essential, because if the fire died in the night, morning became a trial. Flint might fail, kindling might be damp, and without flame, the house would grow still, not peacefully still, but dangerously so. So they watched, not all night, just for a time. When their eyelids grew too heavy, they would nudge the next person. A sibling, a father, a cousin curled beneath a sheepskin. That person would rise, groaning, shivering, blinking into the shadows and take their place. There were no schedules, no hourglasses or bells, just trust, just rhythm, a slow, sleepy rotation. You watched until you could no longer, and then you passed the watch on. And so the ember was guarded, not just from cold, but from the many small misfortunes that could snuff it out: a wayward breeze, a curious pig, a careless kick from a dreaming child. Each watcher had their own method. Some sat upright, back against the wall, hands cupped around a stick they used to prod the coals. Others rocked slowly, humming under their breath, keeping rhythm with their blinking. Some whispered prayers between checks. Others just stared at the glow and thought of spring. It was during these hours, the deep middle of the night, that the mind wandered most. When the world outside seemed farthest away. When the house felt like a fragile boat adrift in a dark and frozen sea. And the fire, even banked and buried, was the lighthouse. A reminder that the night would pass, that the cold could be held at bay, that the sun would return even if it wasn't here yet. By morning, if all had gone well, the embers would still be warm. A few soft breaths, a curl of straw, a twig or two, and the fire would rise again, sleepy, thin at first, then stronger. Light would return to the walls. The day would begin. But none of it could happen, not the warmth, not the cooking, not the morning, without the ember watch. It was a job without praise, without thanks. It left no mark, no story, no song. And yet, it was one of the most important acts of each night. A quiet promise passed hand to hand, hour to hour. We will keep the fire alive. We will make it to morning. Together. Chapter 12. Breathing in Winter. In winter, even breath could betray you. It seems like such a small thing, this simple act of drawing in air, of filling your lungs, of letting go. But in the deep cold of a medieval night, breathing became something you had to think about, something you had to guard, because the air outside was not gentle. It stung, it scraped, it moved like glass across the throat. Inside the hut, it wasn't much better. The fire might warm the room a little, the animals might raise the temperature slightly, but the cold still lived in the air, in every whisper, every sigh, every breath that rose as a mist and vanished into the rafters. And so peasants learned to breathe differently, not through the mouth, never through the mouth. That was the first lesson. A gasp of frozen air pulled straight into the chest could bring pain. It could set off a cough. It could tighten the lungs and leave you wheezing in the dark, clutching your ribs while your family lay helpless beside you. They had no doctors, no medicine beyond a few herbs tucked in cloth, no hot water bottles, no steaming broths made on demand. So prevention was everything. And that began with the nose. Breathing through the nose warmed the air slightly before it reached the lungs. It softened the bite of frost. It gave the body just a little more time to prepare. Children were taught early. Close your mouth, they were told. Wrap your scarf high. Breathe low and slow. Let your chest rise gently. Don't pull too hard. And if they forgot, if a child ran across the yard laughing or shouted out into the snow, the older ones would scold them. You'll catch death like that, they'd say. Because they believed it, and not without reason. Illness in winter was no small matter. A single cold could become something worse. A deep cough, wet and rattling, could linger for weeks. If it worsened, there was little to be done. The fire could not warm a fever. Herbs could only soothe so much, and when the chest gave out, there were no second chances. So breathing became careful, intentional. Some wrapped bits of wool or linen around their faces at night, just a strip across the mouth and nose. It held their warmth close, turned each breath into something softer, gentler. The cloth grew damp by morning, clinging to lips like frost, but it helped. Others tucked their faces beneath their cloaks, pressed their noses into the crook of an arm, curled tight so their own breath warmed the space before them. At night, the cold sharpened. The walls let in wind. The floor stole heat from every limb. And so the family breathed together, shallow, slow, and steady. No one spoke once they were bundled for sleep. Not because they had nothing to say, but because the breath it took to say it cost too much. Silence was warmth. Stillness was protection. Even the animals knew it. The cow's breath came slow and deep, misting in the firelight. The dog curled with its nose under its tail. The chickens clucked quietly in their sleep, feathers fluffed, heads tucked under wing. There were no deep sighs, no loud yawns, just the soft rhythm of shallow life holding on. In the darkest part of night, when the wind was sharpest and the fire was only a whisper beneath the ash, that rhythm became a kind of music, a soft chorus of survival. Inhale, exhale, again and again, each breath a small defiant act. Each breath a promise, I am still here. Some wrapped hot stones near their bedding to warm the air around them. Others hung herbs above the hearth, thyme, rosemary, sage, hoping the scent would clear the lungs, keep the breath strong. Old folk had tricks of their own. Sip broth before sleep, rub a clove of garlic on the chest, speak no words after sundown. Whether it worked or not, it gave comfort. And in winter, comfort mattered. Sometimes someone would cough anyway. A sharp crack in the quiet. A sign that something had slipped past the cloth, past the herbs, past the careful breathing. A mother might rise to wrap another layer around the child. A father might stir the fire, hoping heat would help. But often all they could do was wait, listen, hope, breathe, and remind each other to be careful. Because the air, that thing they needed most, could also be their enemy. So they treated it with respect. They did not waste it. They did not gulp or gasp. They let it in gently and let it go. Again and again. Through winter after winter, through sickness and storm, they learned to breathe not just for living, but for surviving. Not loudly, not quickly, just enough. Because sometimes enough was everything. Chapter 13, Cold That Lingers. Some winters passed like a long sigh, cold, yes, but manageable. Others settled deep into the land, into the bones, into the breath. And when they did, they left something behind. Even when the sun returned, even when the frost melted from the thatched roofs and green buds reappeared in the hedgerows, the cold lingered. Not always in the air, but in the people. You could see it in the way they walked. A slower pace, a stiffness in the knees, the way fingers curled into themselves even when the fire was strong again. A kind of memory lived inside the body of nights too long, winds too sharp, mornings too slow to rise. For many peasants, winter didn't simply pass. It marked them. Frostbite was common, though they didn't call it that. They had no medical terms for it, no diagnosis, no clean definition. But they knew what it looked like, the blackening of a toe, the numbing of fingers, the pain that gave way to something worse, no feeling at all. At first it was sharp, a sting in the fingertips, a burn on the ear. But then it dulled. The skin turned pale, then dark. And when it was over, something was lost. Some survived with scars, others with missing pieces. A fingertip that never felt again. A toe that refused to warm. A patch of skin that cracked each winter no matter how many layers it was wrapped in. Children, too, were not spared. They might cry when the cold bit deep into their toes, but they didn't always know when the danger had passed into damage. By spring, a limp might appear, a change in how they held their hands. The cold, it seemed, had left a mark, and beyond the skin the cold found other ways in. It crept into the lungs. A cough that started as a tickle could deepen into something heavy and wet. They called it lung sickness, chest rot, winter fever. Whatever the name, it took its toll. A person might cough through the night, too weak to rise, too tired to eat. Some got better. Slowly, thinly, with quiet effort. Others faded. And there were no doctors. No apothecaries in most villages. No medicines but what could be gathered, yarrow, thyme, horehound. The women who knew the herbs did what they could. Boiled roots, brewed teas, placed poultices on the chest and whispered prayers beside the fire. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes it didn't. The weak, the elderly, the very young were most at risk, and everyone knew it. Each winter claimed a few. A grandfather who stopped waking. A child who stopped moving. A mother who grew quiet and then still. There were tears, yes. But often, there was only silence. a gentle nod, a folding of hands, a blanket pulled up over the face. Because this was not unexpected. It was simply the cost of winter. Every spring, new graves appeared at the edge of the village. Simple ones, marked by stones, no names carved but remembered in the hearts of those who remained. And for those who lived, there was a weight they carried, not just of grief, but of weariness. The kind of tired that lives in the joints, in the shoulders, in the space between ribs. The kind of tired that doesn't lift just because the days grow warmer. Some winters were crueler than others. The Great Famine of 1315 was one. Rain destroyed the crops, livestock died in the mud. And when winter came, it came like a thief in the night. There wasn't enough food, not enough dry wood, not enough strength. People grew thin, faces hollowed. There were whispers of bark eaten from trees, of broth made from shoe leather, of things too dark to name. And yet, even in the worst winters, some endured, because endurance was the only choice. They wrapped their frostbitten hands and walked anyway. They coughed behind the barn and then returned to stir the pot. They buried the ones they loved and held the children closer. And still they rose, day after day, beneath skies that offered no warmth, across fields that gave no food, inside homes where the fire had to be relit from scratch. The cold may have lingered, but so did they. With cracked skin and weary legs, with thin breath and aching backs, with hands that remembered the burn of ice, and hearts that remembered those who didn't wake. And when the first flowers bloomed again, when the grass returned, and the trees budded, and the sun finally climbed high enough to warm the face, they didn't cheer loudly. They didn't sing or shout. They simply stood a little longer in the light, closed their eyes, and breathed. Because they knew not all had made it, but they had, and that was enough. Chapter 14. The Fire in Their Bones. 550 words. Sleep history. Ali friendly tone. Underscore 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 underscore. Somewhere in the silence between winter's breath and spring's first thaw, there lived a different kind of warmth. Not the heat of a fire, not the shelter of straw, but something quieter, something older. A fire that lived in the bones. You couldn't see it, not like you could see the glow of embers or the rising steam from a stew pot. But it was there. It moved with the body, flickered behind tired eyes, settled deep into the chest. It was the warmth of will, the glow of resilience, the slow-burning fuel of endurance. The medieval peasant had no luxury, no certainty, and yet somehow they made it through. Not all, never all, but enough. Enough to carry the songs forward, enough to mend the roofs again, enough to teach the children how to bank a fire, how to wrap their feet, how to breathe through their noses when the wind came sharp and fast. They had no word for resilience, but they lived it every day. You could see it in their hands, scarred, cracked, weathered by frost and flame. Hands that worked in frozen soil, chopped wood with numb fingers, stirred pots with sleeves drawn over the knuckles. You could see it in their backs, bent not by weakness, but by labor, by lifting, by carrying, by gathering kindling from the edge of the forest, even when the snow reached the knees. And you could hear it in their voices. Not loud, not boastful, just steady, calm. Words spoken with the patience of someone who has survived one winter and expects to survive another. Because that was the truth of it. They did not expect ease. They expected hardship. They prepared for it. They made plans not for comfort, but for survival. A second tunic sewn not for fashion, but for warmth. A bit of fat saved not for flavor, but for fuel. A cracked pot kept not for beauty, but because it could hold broth one more time. Their minds were trained not on hope for luxury, but on readiness, on repetition, on memory. And within those memories, passed from father to son, from mother to daughter, lived the real inheritance. How to pack straw so it doesn't grow damp too quickly. Which herbs to chew when the throat begins to burn. How many breaths it takes to coax a coal into flame. How to feel the wind shift and know a storm is coming. They didn't have books, but their lives were a kind of library, a living archive of survival. Even the quietest child knew things we might not. Which wood burns hot, which moss stays dry. How to hush a baby with a rhythm of rocking that matched the beat of a grandmother's song. There was fire in that knowledge, a steady heat that traveled through generations. And there was pride too, though not the kind we speak of now. Not proud of wealth, not proud of power. Proud of making it through. Proud of waking up with all 10 fingers after a storm. Proud of getting the stew to last another day. Proud of keeping the cow alive. Proud of keeping the fire lit, even if just a coal, even if just enough to spark again. They didn't always speak of this pride, but it showed in how they carried their chores, how they folded the same blanket every night, how they nodded at a neighbor after checking in on their smoke. There was dignity in that, in doing the same small things again and again because you knew they mattered, because you knew that survival isn't always dramatic. Sometimes it's just quiet effort repeated in the dark. Sometimes it's just not giving up. And sometimes it's laughing anyway, because that, too, lived inside them, a sense of humor so dry, so weary that it sounded like sighing. But it was real. It was needed. A comment about the wind sneaking in like a tax collector. A joke about the stew that's seen more winters than the dog. A wink passed over a cup of ale, even when the fire sputtered and the roof leaked and the baby had been coughing all day. They didn't laugh because life was easy. They laughed because it wasn't. And the fire that lived in their bones needed feeding too, not just with warmth, but with joy, however small. Sometimes that joy came from song. Soft ones hummed near the fire. Lullabies made of nonsense and repetition. Tunes that carried the weight of forgotten lyrics but still managed to soothe. Other times it came from stories. Tales passed from one frozen season to the next. Of animals that talked. Of lords who got lost in the snow. Of spirits that stole shoes but returned them with better souls. Even the telling of the worst winters became story. Do you remember the frost of 23? So deep it split the wood beams, so sharp it made the dog whimper, so long it turned the stew to ice when we weren't looking. They told these things not to frighten, but to remember, because memory, too, was a kind of heat. It kept the past alive. It honored those who didn't make it, and it reminded the living that they were part of a long, unbroken chain of endurance. And still the winters came, and still they prepared. They patched the walls again. They gathered the moss again. They swept the hearth, packed the straw, dried the herbs. Not because they believed this winter would be worse, but because they knew one day it might. And the fire in their bones told them, be ready, but don't be afraid. That was the lesson passed down in every act of daily living. Not a lecture, not a sermon, just a glance at the sky, a quiet breath, a hand reaching for another's to help them to their feet. Some of them died young, but most of them lived longer than you'd expect. Because they shared, because they worked, because they watched the fire and listened to the wind and knew how to stretch a meal just one more day. Because they were not fragile. They were built like the earth, hard, weathered, but warm too in the places that mattered most. And today, in all the warmth we enjoy, in every blanket, every full pantry, every fire that burns with ease, there is something of them. In every quiet breath we take in the cold, knowing we will be fine. They are there. Not in books, not in statues, but in the resilience we carry without realizing, passed down like an ember that never went out. The fire that lived in their bones, it lives in us too. Chapter 15. Spring at last. The end didn't come all at once. There was no trumpet to mark it. No sudden flood of light or burst of birdsong. No announcement from the sky that the season had passed. Just a softness. Just a shift. Barely noticed at first, the way the frost seemed thinner on the ground one morning. The way the sun lingered just a little longer behind the trees. The way a thin thread of birdsong found its way into the quiet. Spring was not loud. It was patient. And it arrived not with a roar, but with a sigh. For the medieval peasant, that sigh was everything. It meant the long winter had been endured, that the fire had lasted, that the roof had held, that the frost had not claimed every corner of the home or every name in the household. It meant breath, real breath, could be taken without pain, through the nose, through the mouth, through the full lungs. It meant hands no longer had to be buried in cloth just to stir the pot. It meant a door could be opened wide, and the wind that drifted in would feel like air again, not like teeth. They knew better than to celebrate too early. April could still bite. March could still surprise. Snow might fall again. But something had shifted, and they felt it in their bones long before the fields had greened. The mud came first. The ground, frozen solid for months, softened, not gracefully. It gave way with a kind of groaning, squelching beneath boots, swallowing the wheel tracks of carts, turning the well-trodden paths into quiet swamps. It was messy, it was cold, but it was not winter. Children ran through it anyway. Chickens scratched at the thawing soil. Dogs rolled in the patches where the sun touched longest. And the peasants began to work again. Not that they had stopped entirely. Firewood still had to be split, stew still had to be made, animals still needed care. But now came the other work, the hopeful work. Tools were pulled from walls where they'd hung since autumn. Iron rusted over was scraped clean. Blades were sharpened by stone. Baskets mended. Ropes checked. Hands, rough from winter, found familiar rhythms again. The fields were watched. Nothing yet, but soon. Last year's stubble was cleared. Cow dung that had piled in winter was spread across the dirt, a gift of warmth, of promise. Seeds still waited, carefully kept in cloth sacks or clay jars. Inside the house, things changed too. The rushes were cleared from the floor. Not all at once, not easily. Layers of winter straw, black with soot and damp with memory, were hauled outside, dumped on the compost heap, or burned in a smoky pile that smelled of earth and smoke and everything that had happened in the dark months. New rushes were cut, green, fragrant, fresh. Some were laid beneath the sleeping areas, others braided into mats. A small thing, but a sign. Blankets were aired, clothes hung outside. The wind, though cool, began to smell less like ice and more like moss, like soil, like life coming back. The fire still burned, but lower now, just enough to boil the pot, to warm the room as evening came. No longer the hungry, constant flame it had been in January. No longer the dragon that had to be fed every hour. The family spread out a little at night. No longer all clumped into one corner like a bundle of roots. Elbows could stretch. Cloaks could be removed. The dog found its way to the other side of the room. Even the silence changed. It was still quiet. This was still the medieval countryside, after all. But now, the quiet held sounds within it. A drip of thawed water. The distant bleating of lambs. The low hum of insects rising again, shy and slow. And then one day the buds appeared. Not many, not loud, but there, on the edge of the thatch, on the tips of branches, on the border of fields that had seemed dead. Green, not bright, not brilliant, just soft, just real. And in that moment, the peasant knew. The worst had passed. They had made it. There would be no feast, no parade, just the quiet resumption of life. Bread baked with a bit less caution. A song hummed without needing to drown out fear. A door left open longer. A step taken with less weight, less worry. Neighbors who had not seen each other in weeks met again on the path. Not with embraces, not with tears, just with nods, with soft looks, with shared memories of fire, of frost, of the names that had not made it. Graves were tended, slowly, carefully. Stones straightened, prayers whispered. No one had the luxury of long mourning, but everyone remembered. because spring, as welcome as it was, always carried the echo of who was missing to see it. Still, the peasants moved forward, not because they had forgotten, but because they had learned. Again. They had learned, again, that endurance was possible, that the human body could ache and heal, that the fire could fade and rise, that the world, no matter how long it slept beneath snow, would wake. And so would they. Gardens were turned. Children chased each other between rows that would soon hold cabbage and leeks. Men hoisted sacks of grain and began to measure how much could be spared for seed. Women unwrapped saved herbs dried last summer and used the last of them to soothe lingering coughs. The rhythm of life did not return all at once. It did not need to. It crept in slowly, like light through a shutter. But it returned, because the world turns, because the earth remembers, because after every long, dark sleep something stirs, and the peasants, with their cracked hands, their worn shoes, their memories of fire and frost, stirred with it. Not with fanfare, but with purpose. They rose and worked and mended and planted. They cooked and shared and prayed and remembered. And in each act, no matter how small, there was triumph. Not the kind with flags or drums, but the kind that lives in a warm bowl passed between hands, in a cloak hung up for the season, in a laugh that rises not from joy but from relief. That kind of triumph. The kind that says we stayed. The kind that says we lasted. The kind that says we are still here. And as the air grew warmer and the days grew longer and the fields turned green beneath their feet, spring at last answered them, with light, with growth, with silence broken by song, and with the simple, sacred gift of another season, another chance, another breath,